Have you ever tried to prove yourself during an argument and later felt the tension still hanging in the air? You began explaining your perspective. You carefully laid out your reasoning. Maybe you even corrected someone in front of others because you were certain you were right. In that moment, it felt powerful. It felt like control, like you were finally standing firm and asserting yourself. But a few minutes later, something changed. The atmosphere became colder. The quiet sense of respect slowly slipped away. The conversation that once felt important gradually became draining. There is a quiet truth about human nature that people have recognized for centuries. The moment we try to dominate a discussion, we often lose control instead. Proving we are right can trick the mind into believing we are winning, while in reality, we are creating tension and resistance. Arguments rarely educate or persuade. More often they divide and exhaust. True influence rarely appears in the heat of conflict. It emerges quietly through patience, through observation, and through the ability to remain calm even when others lose control. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." When you begin to grasp that idea, the way you approach conflict and even life itself starts to shift. Most people assume arguments are about discovering truth. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Two people disagree, they exchange ideas, and eventually the stronger reasoning should prevail. But real conversations rarely unfold that way. Most arguments revolve around ego. Someone feels dismissed. Someone senses their status is being challenged. Their identity or competence feels threatened. At that moment, the discussion changes from understanding to defending. Small signals reveal it: a tightened jaw, a brief pause before replying, a slight shift in tone. Pride begins to take control. Logic slowly steps back. People stop listening for understanding and start listening for flaws. The more someone tries to prove they are right, the less others truly hear them. What remains is tension, subtle resentment, and a distance that can quietly grow over time. Think back to the last time you had a heated exchange. Maybe it happened at work, at home, or somewhere online. At first, the issue seemed minor, just a difference of opinion, a misunderstanding, or a small criticism. Then something shifted. Voices sharpened. Words became precise, almost like weapons. Instead of asking questions, statements were used to corner the other person. Each reply carried more emotion. Soon, the conversation stopped being about solving anything. It became about holding ground. Someone needed to be right. Someone needed to avoid looking wrong. By that point, the original issue was rarely resolved. What remained was friction and an unspoken sense that something meaningful had been lost. This pattern has existed for centuries. Observers of human behavior noticed how quickly pride enters a conversation, taking control before reason has the chance to intervene. Marcus Aurelius once said, "You always have the option of having no opinion." Most arguments continue because someone feels the need to defend a position. Stepping back may feel unnatural, yet it can be deeply liberating. Letting go of the need to prove yourself creates space to observe what is actually happening. Observation, more than quick reaction, restores control. Instead of reacting instantly, you watch. You notice tone, posture, and the subtle emotional currents guiding every word. Arguments escalate because emotion moves faster than reason. The brain treats disagreement as a threat to status or competence. Reaction appears almost immediately, while logic follows behind. Words are spoken from impulse rather than clarity. Seneca once said, "No man was ever wise by chance." Wisdom demands awareness. It requires the discipline to notice what is happening inside your mind before words leave your mouth. Without that awareness, conversations become automatic reactions. The stronger the emotion becomes, the weaker reasoning grows. People stop searching for solutions and begin focusing on victory. Once you recognize these patterns, a quiet shift begins. Instead of reacting to provocation, you start observing the dynamics behind the conversation. You notice the triggers, the pride, and the hidden motives beneath each statement. You learn to respond intentionally instead of impulsively. Calm observation creates space where insight can appear. Tense conversations become mirrors, revealing not only the patterns of the other person, but also your own. Awareness allows you to engage without losing control. You can influence without force. Over time, this habit transforms the way interactions unfold. Validation before argument, observation before reaction, and awareness before engagement slowly reshape the conversation. The person across from you begins to notice your steadiness. Their attempts to provoke become less effective because the usual reactions that feed tension are no longer present. You are no longer trapped in the emotional cycle of every disagreement. Instead, you guide the discussion quietly while preserving your energy and clarity. People naturally begin approaching you differently. They bring problems rather than arguments, questions rather than challenges. Your influence grows without confrontation because steadiness itself carries authority. This approach requires no manipulation and no deception. It is grounded in presence, patience, and self-awareness. You are not ignoring the other person. You are simply recognizing the futility of certain conflicts and choosing carefully where to invest your energy. Aristotle once said, "Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet." The patience of observing without reacting may feel difficult at first, yet it eventually produces calm, credibility, and influence. Your presence alone becomes stabilizing. Conversations become constructive rather than combative. Relationships improve not through force, but through steady restraint and thoughtful engagement. Ultimately, the mastery of conversation lies in choosing peace over victory. Calm steadiness shapes interactions in subtle yet powerful ways. You are not defensive, you are not reactive, you are composed. Your words carry weight because they are deliberate rather than impulsive. Over time, people learn that arguing with you leads nowhere. Influence grows quietly but consistently. Every moment you resist the urge to fight becomes a moment where your control over the conversation and over your own mind becomes stronger. And once this discipline takes root, you begin to notice that life itself moves more smoothly because you are no longer pulled into every unnecessary conflict. If this perspective resonates with you, consider subscribing as a quiet commitment to cultivating calm, clarity, and wisdom in your own life. Each time you engage with this content, you take a deliberate step toward mastering your mind rather than simply reacting to the world. The deeper issue is that arguments often feel satisfying in the moment. There is a certain rush that comes from delivering the perfect response or exposing a weakness in someone else's reasoning. For a brief moment, it can feel like victory. But that feeling fades quickly. What usually remains afterward is distance. The other person walks away remembering the tension rather than the insight. The irritation that fuels arguments is rarely about the other person alone. Often it reveals our own sensitivities, our insecurities, and the areas where our identity feels fragile. When someone touches those areas, the reaction can feel automatic. But recognizing that reaction is the beginning of freedom. Instead of immediately responding with force, you start noticing the pattern itself. When you begin seeing arguments through this perspective, a new understanding starts to form. Disagreements are not tests of intelligence, they are tests of emotional discipline. The person who remains calm in the middle of tension usually holds the real advantage, not because they have stronger opinions, but because they are not carried away by the emotional current of the moment. Epictetus once said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When someone disagrees with you, the disturbance rarely comes from their words alone. It comes from the meaning your mind assigns to those words. Perhaps it feels like disrespect, perhaps it feels like rejection. But when you begin separating the event from the judgment, the emotional grip loosens. You can hear criticism without immediately turning it into a threat, and that single shift changes the direction of the conversation. The surprising result is that calmness often carries more influence than forceful arguments ever could. When someone refuses to be pulled into emotional conflict, the rhythm of the entire discussion begins to change. The tension has nowhere to attach itself. Instead of reacting quickly, the calm person listens, observes, and responds with measured clarity. Over time, people start noticing that difference. They sense stability in someone who does not rush to defend themselves. They sense strength in someone who does not need to raise their voice to be heard. Slowly, without any dramatic display, the balance of the conversation shifts. Others begin speaking more carefully. The atmosphere softens, and what once felt like a potential conflict begins to resemble understanding. From that point forward, the question becomes less about proving yourself right and more about recognizing the deeper reasons we feel compelled to argue in the first place. The real answer is pride. Most arguments do not begin with complex ideas or deep disagreements. They begin with something much smaller. Someone questions your opinion. Someone criticizes a decision you made. Someone says something that makes you feel misunderstood, dismissed, or slightly disrespected. And it can happen in seconds. One sentence is enough. And almost instantly, your mind begins preparing a reply. You search for the perfect explanation. Your thoughts organize facts and examples. Your heart rate rises slightly. The body tightens in subtle ways you hardly notice. In that brief instant, the mind believes it is protecting itself. But something important has already happened beneath the surface. You have accepted the invitation to fight, not with fists, but with words. And once that invitation is accepted, the conversation starts moving in a direction that is very difficult to reverse. This reaction feels natural because the human mind is designed to protect identity. When someone questions your view, the brain often interprets it as a challenge to your competence or intelligence. Even a small disagreement can feel like a subtle attack on who you are. That is why responses appear so quickly. The mind rushes forward to defend its position before reason has fully examined the situation. Marcus Aurelius once said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That insight reveals something quiet but powerful. The words spoken by another person are rarely the true problem. What truly drives the reaction is the meaning your mind attaches to those words. When you interpret disagreement as disrespect, emotion rises instantly. But when you see it as information, the situation changes. The same words suddenly carry far less weight. This is where discipline begins to matter. Most people react before they even realize they are reacting. The response appears automatically, shaped by habit and emotion. Yet there is a small moment between hearing something and responding to it. That moment is almost invisible, but it exists. In that brief space lies a surprising amount of freedom. Epictetus once said, "Make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens." Your reaction belongs to that small circle of things within your control. When you learn to pause inside that moment instead of rushing past it, the entire direction of a conversation begins to shift. Instead of reacting automatically, you observe the situation as it unfolds. You notice the tone of the other person's voice. You notice your own rising emotions, and for the first time you begin choosing your response rather than being carried away by it. The disciplined mind behaves very differently from the reactive mind. Instead of defending itself immediately, it becomes curious. Curiosity can be surprisingly powerful in moments of tension. When someone challenges your view, curiosity breaks the expected pattern. Instead of pushing back, you slow the conversation. You might ask a simple question like, "Help me understand what you mean," or "Why do you see it that way?" Sometimes you might ask what concerns them most about the situation. These questions do not weaken your position. They simply change the structure of the exchange. Suddenly, the other person is explaining instead of attacking. Their attention shifts away from confrontation and toward clarification. The conversation begins moving in a new direction where understanding becomes possible again. When curiosity replaces defense, the emotional temperature in the room often drops almost immediately. People rarely expect calm questions when they are prepared for resistance. The tension loses its momentum because there is nothing to push against. Instead of building a wall between opposing positions, the conversation opens a small path where both sides can examine the issue together. Seneca once said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Delay does not mean remaining silent forever. It simply means giving reason the time it needs to catch up with emotion. When you pause long enough to ask a thoughtful question instead of delivering an immediate defense, you create space for clarity to enter the discussion. But curiosity alone does not dissolve every conflict. Words are only one part of what influences people during disagreements. Beneath every statement lies a feeling that is often stronger than the argument itself. Someone may speak sharply, not because the issue is important, but because they feel unheard. Someone may challenge your idea not because it is flawed, but because they feel their own voice has been overlooked. When irritation appears in a conversation, it often reveals emotional currents that logic alone cannot resolve. Recognizing those emotions changes how you respond. Instead of trying to overpower someone with reasoning, you begin noticing what the conversation is really about. Once you begin seeing these emotional undercurrents, your approach becomes more patient. You start listening not only to the words being spoken, but also to the feelings behind them. A person who feels respected becomes far more open to hearing another perspective. A person who feels ignored will often argue even harder, regardless of how strong the reasoning against them may be. That is why calm attention can be more powerful than forceful persuasion. The goal is no longer to win quickly, but to understand what is actually driving the disagreement. When people sense that they are being heard, their need to defend themselves slowly fades. This shift in perspective transforms the entire nature of disagreement. Instead of rushing to prove yourself correct, you begin observing the conversation as it unfolds. The focus moves from defending your position to understanding the situation. That small change may seem subtle at first, but its effect is profound. The argument loses its urgency. The pressure to respond immediately fades away. In its place appears something quieter and far more productive, a space where listening matters just as much as speaking. And once that space begins to open, the conversation naturally moves toward a deeper realization about how emotions shape every conflict that follows. People rarely argue because they are searching for facts or clarity. The assumption that arguments are a search for truth is often misleading. Most disagreements are driven by something far more basic: the need for validation. Someone feels dismissed. Someone feels unheard. Someone senses that their perspective, their effort, or even their presence is being overlooked. And the moment those feelings appear, logic quietly steps aside. You can present facts, share evidence, or build the most precise argument possible, but if the other person feels attacked, their mind closes before you even finish speaking. This is why attention to emotion often matters more than the content of the argument itself. It is the invisible current guiding the flow of nearly every disagreement. Yet most people overlook it because they rush to speak before truly understanding. Imagine a situation where someone you care about or work with says, "You never listen to me." The instinct appears almost instantly. You feel the urge to defend yourself, to prove the accusation is wrong. "That's not true," you might reply. In that split second, the emotional tension rises even higher. The defense, no matter how justified, does nothing to ease the tension. Instead, it reinforces the sense of opposition. A wiser response takes a different path. You reply with calm honesty, acknowledging the feeling without abandoning your own perspective. You might say, "I can understand why it might feel that way," or "I see why this situation could be frustrating for you." That small shift, just a few carefully chosen words, creates a remarkable effect. It interrupts the reactive cycle. It removes the need for the other person to escalate and signals that their feelings are being recognized. Once someone feels heard, their mind softens, their posture relaxes, and the door for reason quietly begins to open. There is a quiet strength in acknowledging emotion before introducing logic. Logic without empathy often feels like a weapon. Empathy without understanding feels hollow. Epictetus once said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." In disagreements, this is exactly what happens. People are rarely disturbed by the words themselves, but by the meaning they attach to them. Realizing this allows you to step into an entirely different approach. You are no longer fighting a duel of statements. Instead, you are observing, listening, and gently guiding the conversation toward clarity. Validation is not surrender. It simply removes the emotional barrier that blocks constructive dialogue. By recognizing what someone feels before addressing what is argued, you create a foundation where clarity can emerge without provoking defensiveness. Even when emotions are acknowledged, another layer often remains. Sometimes an argument continues not because someone truly believes they are correct, but because admitting they are wrong feels like a threat to their identity. Pride can anchor a position far more strongly than evidence ever could. Once a person has publicly taken a stance, stepping back can feel like losing a part of themselves. Socrates once said, "He is richest who is content with the least, for content is the wealth of nature." In this situation, contentment does not mean accepting another person's view without thought. It means letting go of the constant need to prove superiority in every exchange. When you understand the role of pride, it becomes clear why arguments often continue long after the factual issue has already been resolved. The discussion turns into a struggle over image rather than insight, an effort to preserve dignity rather than discover truth. The strength of addressing emotion first is that it opens the door for meaningful discussion while removing unnecessary conflict. Instead of focusing on proving yourself right, you create an environment where the other person no longer feels the need to fight. The conversation transforms into a shared exploration rather than a contest of wills. Observing how pride and the desire for validation influence interactions also reveals patterns within yourself. You start noticing the triggers that spark defensiveness, the moments when reactions happen automatically, and the small opportunities where you can respond with intention. Self-awareness becomes the foundation of influence. It allows you to act instead of react, to guide instead of dominate, and to maintain peace without sacrificing clarity. Once someone feels understood, their resistance naturally begins to fade. You no longer need to overwhelm them with counter-arguments or flood the room with evidence. Calm listening alone creates a psychological shift. The other person feels respected. Their mind relaxes, and the argument often softens on its own. It is a subtle, almost invisible redirection of energy, yet it is deeply effective. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." In conversations, wasting energy on defensive arguments is one of the easiest ways to drain mental and emotional strength. When you focus on listening first, responding second, and understanding throughout, the time spent becomes productive, the interaction constructive, and the relationship preserved. There is also a strategic dimension to this. Arguments rarely resolve when one person is trying to avoid appearing wrong. When someone's self-image is on the line, they hold on to their position even when they privately recognize its weaknesses. Understanding the psychological stakes of an argument is a form of wisdom. When you realize that the real conflict is not about facts, but about self-perception, you gain the ability to choose how and when to respond. You are no longer blindly participating in the struggle. You are observing the situation, recognizing motives, and choosing your actions carefully. The conversation stops being a contest of cleverness and becomes an opportunity to maintain clarity, composure, and stability. The transformation begins when you shift from defending to understanding, from reacting to observing, and from proving to guiding. Once emotions are acknowledged and pride is respected, arguments lose their urgency. People begin listening instead of attacking. Words stop behaving like weapons and start functioning as tools for clarity. The conversation moves forward without unnecessary tension, allowing both sides to reach a point where insight can emerge. In that environment, disagreement no longer feels threatening. Instead, it becomes manageable, productive, and even enlightening. The subtle power of validation before logic, observation before reaction, and awareness before defense gradually reshapes every interaction. And it is within this quiet discipline that real control and influence begin. Human beings protect their dignity with an intensity that often surprises even those closest to them. It is woven into the way we navigate the world. When someone feels cornered or pressured to admit a mistake, the instinctive reaction is rarely calm acceptance, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the mind is wired to protect identity. The possibility of public embarrassment or perceived weakness triggers an almost automatic defense. You can notice it in small details: a tightened jaw, a quick rebuttal, a refusal to make eye contact. These signals may seem subtle, yet they completely alter the direction of a conversation. A simple phrase like, "You're wrong," carries far more weight than the words themselves. Even when delivered politely, it can cause someone's attention to shift away from the topic and toward defending their sense of self. The goal of the conversation stops being clarity or truth and becomes self-preservation. Yet, there is a path that avoids this trap without forcing you to abandon your own perspective. Instead of confronting someone directly, you can gently invite reflection by sharing that you once held a similar view. A phrase like, "I used to see it that way too until I noticed something interesting," quietly opens a door. It reframes the conversation. Now, you are no longer positioned above them, you are beside them. Both of you once shared the same understanding. The difference is not presented as superiority, but as a shared discovery. This subtle shift dissolves defensive energy and allows reconsideration without threatening pride. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." The reaction to a challenge, not the challenge itself, determines the tone of the conversation. When disagreement is framed as exploration rather than correction, dignity is preserved on both sides, while the conversation still moves toward insight. Of course, patience and empathy do not guarantee that every disagreement will resolve easily. Some individuals cling to their position for reasons deeper than logic or emotion. Their identity becomes intertwined with their stance. trying to force them to change or confronting them aggressively almost always backfires. It often intensifies tension, deepens defensiveness, or permanently closes the path for communication. In those moments, knowing when to redirect the discussion becomes essential. Rather than continuing a dialogue that strengthens resistance, a skilled communicator shifts the focus. This might involve exploring a different aspect of the topic, inviting a broader perspective, or even pausing the discussion entirely to allow time for reflection. Marcus Aurelius once said, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." This principle also applies to conversations. It is often wiser to preserve the relationship and the potential for influence than to demand immediate agreement. One practical way to protect dignity is subtle alignment with shared values. Instead of dismissing an idea outright, you can acknowledge the parts of it that are thoughtful or meaningful. For example, if someone proposes a plan you disagree with, you can recognize the effort, intention, or reasoning behind it. By validating the purpose behind their thinking, you reduce the instinct to defend while still opening the door to alternative viewpoints. Seneca once said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Much of the tension in arguments is created through anticipation or fear of judgment, rather than the actual substance of the discussion. When emotion is addressed before logic, imagined threats fade and resistance decreases, making genuine understanding possible. Ultimately, mastery in conversation does not come from proving others wrong. It comes from creating an environment where ideas can be exchanged without the interference of ego. This skill is subtle and requires observation, reflection, and a willingness to value dignity over immediate victory. By practicing patience, acknowledging emotion first, and framing differences as shared exploration rather than confrontation, dialogue becomes a tool for influence rather than conflict. This approach preserves relationships, opens minds, and allows ideas to integrate naturally. Over time, these habits create a rhythm where disagreements no longer escalate and influence grows without force. In this way, patience, empathy, and understanding become the true instruments of conversational power, guiding discussions toward insight while protecting dignity and respect. Imagine two colleagues engaged in a heated debate about strategy. One insists the plan carries too much risk. The other believes it is necessary. Voices rise, interruptions appear, and the air grows heavy with frustration. This scene is familiar in workplaces, families, and friendships. Yet a single calm question can reset the entire dynamic. Let's pause for a moment. What outcome are we both trying to achieve? The focus shifts away from ego and toward purpose. The discussion now centers on results rather than superiority. Defensive walls begin to lower because the conversation is no longer about who is right. It becomes about what works best. The dynamic changes from confrontation to collaboration, and what once seemed adversarial becomes a shared exploration. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the absolute truth." When perspective shifts, the argument often loses its strength without a single point needing to be conceded. Using silence effectively requires patience and awareness. It is neither avoidance nor submission. It is the deliberate choice to allow the emotional current to settle before introducing thought or guidance. Within that quiet space, insight becomes possible. The conversation is no longer driven by reactive impulses, but by conscious intention. This approach becomes especially valuable when dealing with people whose pride or emotional investment is high. Instead of trying to overpower them with reasoning or debate, you allow reflection to take place, giving their mind the time to confront its own inconsistencies or unexamined motives. Often the pressure to respond immediately is born from anticipation rather than necessity. Silence allows reality to catch up with expectation. When reframing and silence are used together, their effect becomes even stronger. A carefully timed question can redirect attention, while a pause can dissolve tension long enough for rational thought to return. The person across from you is no longer trapped inside the emotional cycle that fuels most conflicts. They begin to think rather than react, to consider rather than oppose. This is the essence of influence without force. It is not about dominating a discussion or proving a point. It is about creating conditions where insight, understanding, and cooperation can naturally grow. By observing not only your own impulses, but also the emotional rhythm of the discussion, you gain the ability to act with clarity and restraint, shaping the dialogue instead of being shaped by it. Ultimately, mastery in dialogue is achieved not through dominance, but through subtle guidance. Reframing conversations and using silence create a rhythm where arguments gradually lose momentum and understanding begins to grow. Defensive barriers fall naturally when the focus shifts to shared objectives rather than personal victory. People begin to listen, not because they feel forced, but because the environment you create encourages reflection rather than reaction. The conversation becomes a space for clarity instead of prideful assertion. Each disagreement becomes an opportunity to notice the currents of ego, emotion, and perception, to adjust your own responses, and to guide the dialogue toward resolution. By mastering the art of reframing and the quiet strength of silence, influence can be exercised without confrontation, and interactions slowly transform from conflict into cooperation. Silence is far more powerful than most people realize, yet it is often misunderstood. Many assume that remaining quiet makes them appear weak, as if failing to respond immediately means surrendering the argument. In reality, the opposite is true. Calm silence can carry more authority than 100 arguments. The moment someone provokes you and you react instantly, you have already surrendered control. Their words have pressed a button within you, and your reaction confirms it. But when you pause, when you allow that small moment of stillness to linger, the entire dynamic begins to change. The energy in the room shifts. The conversation loses its frantic rhythm. The other person, confronted with your restraint, often begins filling the silence themselves. They clarify their own statements, soften their tone, and sometimes even reconsider the assumptions behind what they said. It is within this quiet space that influence begins to appear without a single raised voice or sharp response. Silence interrupts the cycle of conflict because it introduces time into the exchange. When both sides rush to assert themselves, logic is drowned beneath emotion and conversations spiral into defensiveness. By simply pausing, you create an opening where reasoning can return, where reflection becomes possible, and where composure can guide the next step. Marcus Aurelius once said, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" Through silence, you prevent that initial surge of anger from taking control, and by doing so, you reduce the chance that the conversation will leave lasting damage. The person who learns to remain calm and quiet in the face of provocation gains a subtle authority. They are no longer pushed around by circumstance or emotion. Instead, they shape the exchange through restraint and awareness. Silence is not emptiness. It is presence. It is observation. It is a form of quiet power that very few people choose to use deliberately. Yet silence is not merely waiting. It is an active practice requiring awareness and intention. The Stoics understood this well. They trained themselves to pause before reacting, allowing reason to surface after the initial surge of emotion. Epictetus once said, "There is only one way to happiness, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will. In conversation, silence becomes the vehicle for this principle. You stop trying to control what the other person says and focus instead on regulating your own responses. You maintain balance while observing the interaction of words, tone, and subtle emotional signals. This deliberate pause transforms what could have been a reactive exchange into a measured dialogue. The room grows calmer, and the conversation often follows that calm because your composure interrupts the normal rhythm of escalation. Even when silence is mastered, it is important to recognize that not every situation can be resolved. Some conflicts persist regardless of how disciplined or patient you are. Others remain unchanged because the other person is deeply invested in defending an idea or identity at any cost. Accepting that some arguments are unwinnable is a key element of calm influence. It is the understanding that control does not come from forcing agreement, but from maintaining your own state of mind. You may not persuade everyone and you may not settle every disagreement, but you can protect your composure, maintain your dignity, and preserve your energy. Choosing silence in those moments is not surrender. It is a wise decision about where your attention and influence should be invested. Practiced consistently, silence subtly transforms the landscape of every relationship and interaction. When others realize that their provocations no longer trigger immediate reactions, they begin to approach conversations differently. They pause, reconsider, and often moderate their tone without any direct instruction. The power of this approach lies not in domination, but in the quiet establishment of boundaries. It communicates that you are grounded, that your balance cannot be easily disturbed, and that emotional manipulation or impulsive challenges will no longer control your behavior. Seneca once said, "He who is brave is free." Silence can be a form of bravery in social interaction. It frees you from the tyranny of immediate impulse and allows you to exercise control without aggression. This practice also has a deep effect on your own mental state. Reacting instantly traps you in cycles of emotion, frustration, anger, and resentment long after the conversation ends. By embracing silence, you create space for reflection, preventing escalation both during the moment and afterward. The discipline strengthens emotional resilience, allowing you to choose responses aligned with your principles rather than temporary feelings. It becomes a pause that sharpens clarity, strengthens focus, and supports strategic thinking. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." In conversation, silence becomes a tool for self-knowledge. It allows you to notice triggers, recognize patterns, and respond deliberately instead of reacting automatically. The quiet power of silence also extends beyond immediate conflicts. Over time, it shapes how people perceive you. Those who respond with calm restraint are not seen as timid or weak. They are viewed as deliberate, measured, and dependable. Their words carry weight not because they speak loudly, but because they speak with precision and timing. They project a sense of stability that begins to influence interactions even before a discussion starts. The strategic use of silence, combined with careful observation and thoughtful engagement, allows you to navigate conversations with far greater control. It teaches patience, protects relationships, and creates influence without confrontation. Plato once said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." By mastering the art of silence, you align yourself with those who speak with intention and act with presence, guiding discussions not through force, but through the quiet authority of restraint and understanding. Some people, however, are not truly seeking understanding. They are seeking opposition. They feel compelled to assert themselves, to challenge, to control the rhythm of the conversation rather than explore ideas. You have probably encountered someone like this. No matter how carefully you express your thoughts, how calmly you explain, or how patient you remain, they continue to push back. Every discussion becomes a debate, and every disagreement turns into a performance. It becomes exhausting because logic alone cannot win such exchanges. Trying to convince them often feels like speaking to a wall. The more effort you invest, the more resistance seems to appear. In those moments, the usual rules of conversation no longer apply. The person you are engaging with has already decided that disagreement matters more than insight. Responding with your normal strategies only feeds the cycle, strengthening tension and drawing you into unnecessary conflict. The solution, counterintuitive as it may seem, the solution is to withdraw your energy, not out of fear or submission, but as a deliberate choice to preserve calm and focus. You do not need to correct every misunderstanding, explain every decision, or justify your life choices to someone who has already made up their mind. Calm detachment becomes the most powerful form of influence. By acknowledging another person's perspective politely and then choosing not to engage further in proving yourself, you maintain control of your mind while releasing the tension that drives conflict. Seneca once said, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." Often, the anticipation of argument is more exhausting than the exchange itself. Stepping back removes you from the drama without compromising integrity. The benefits of this approach are subtle but profound. When you stop investing energy in unwinnable battles, your conversations become quieter. Others may continue to push, but their attempts are less effective because you no longer react impulsively. The dynamic shifts from confrontation to observation. You notice patterns in how people provoke and learn where your own triggers lie. Calm detachment does not mean disengagement, it means choosing where engagement is meaningful. Time, attention, and emotional energy are finite resources. Allocating them wisely allows you to focus on matters that truly count. As this practice develops, people begin to notice. Your words carry weight not because of volume, but because of measured intention. Attempts to provoke you fail to elicit a reaction. You become difficult to manipulate, difficult to anger, and difficult to distract. This quiet authority is earned through composure, not dominance. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Here, making the darkness conscious means recognizing emotional currents, pride-driven provocations, and triggers that others try to exploit. Once you see them clearly, you no longer need to fight them. You respond with awareness, not reflex, and the other person's ability to control the conversation diminishes naturally. Withdrawing your energy is also an investment in your well-being. Engaging endlessly with people who thrive on opposition drains focus, patience, and vitality. Marcus Aurelius said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Here, the obstacle is not their words, but your impulse to react. Redirecting your attention transforms potential drain into opportunity. Energy saved can be applied where reasoning, patience, and dialogue make a real difference. Over time, the distinction between expendable conflict and meaningful engagement becomes clearer. This approach is not manipulation or deceit. It is rooted in presence, self-awareness, and understanding human behavior. You are not ignoring the other person. You are recognizing the futility of certain confrontations and preserving your energy and clarity. It is mastery over oneself, not others. Practitioners become increasingly resilient, able to navigate conflicts calmly even when provoked, focusing on meaningful objectives rather than unnecessary battles. As this discipline integrates into daily interactions, its effects compound. People notice a rare steadiness, a quiet presence that does not react to every provocation. You do not need to argue to be respected or escalate to be heard. Your calmness shapes the environment, shifting the dynamics of dialogue naturally. Observing provocations and choosing where to invest energy becomes a tool for self-knowledge, influence, and effective communication. Over time, your presence becomes unshakable and quietly compelling, guiding social interactions with strength without raising your voice. When someone speaks, it is heard more carefully, more thoughtfully. Words carry weight not by volume, but by consistency and calm authority. Maintaining composure under pressure stabilizes the environment, and people instinctively adjust to your steadiness, even unconsciously. Carl Jung once said, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order." Cultivating calm amid conflict makes you a living example of that hidden order. Conversations that once spiraled into tension take on a different rhythm, shaped by observation, reflection, and quiet influence. This effect extends beyond individual discussions. People bring problems, not arguments, questions, not disputes. This is subtle authority earned through restraint, a type of influence that commands attention naturally. Understanding your reactions, knowing when to step back, and consistently choosing calm over agitation builds trust. Others see that you are not easily manipulated, not drawn into unnecessary battles, and focused on solutions rather than proving a point. This quiet competence encourages cooperation and respect far more than loud argumentation ever could. Choosing peace over victory enhances emotional clarity. By refusing to react impulsively, you gain time to assess what truly matters, what deserves engagement, and what can be allowed to pass. Decisions are made intentionally rather than reactively. Conflicts are judged for significance, not emotional charge. This clarity reduces stress, conserves energy, and prevents the entanglement that often accompanies reactive arguments. By intentionally stepping back from unnecessary disputes, you prevent imagined conflicts from dictating your emotional state, preserving mental and emotional resources for situations where deliberate action is meaningful and productive. As your steadiness is recognized, people speak more cautiously, consider your perspective more openly, and are more likely to collaborate than compete. The environment you cultivate becomes calmer, more constructive, and less prone to conflict. Relationships improve not through persuasion or force, but through consistent patience, restraint, and rational composure. Observing interactions without reacting impulsively offers insight into both others' motivations and your own patterns, allowing growth and refinement in how you engage with the world. Calmness becomes a mirror for self-awareness, creating influence without aggression and change without confrontation. The ultimate effect is transformative. You become a stabilizing presence whose influence encourages reflection, measured dialogue, and thoughtful problem-solving. People instinctively know attempts to provoke or control will fail, and they adjust accordingly. Energy that once fueled endless arguments is redirected toward productive exchanges, shared objectives, and relationships grounded in respect and trust. Choosing peace over victory is not weakness, it is strength. It requires observation, self-control, and prioritizing long-term stability over short-term triumph. Each moment of restraint reinforces the pattern, creating profound cumulative effects. You are steady, composed, and a quiet authority. Your presence stabilizes interactions that might otherwise escalate. Your discipline shapes conversations, reputation, relationships, and inner life. The world responds not to aggression, but to calm, reasoned influence. Mastering this discipline grants a power many overlook and few achieve. This is the subtle art of staying grounded, choosing composure, and cultivating influence through serenity and deliberate presence. Mastering calm, choosing peace over victory, is not about avoiding life, it is about shaping it. When you respond with steadiness, you protect your mind, preserve your energy, and quietly influence your surroundings. Every conversation becomes an opportunity for understanding, every challenge a chance to practice restraint, and every moment of calm builds a foundation for a stronger, wiser self. If these principles take root, you'll notice something extraordinary. People listen more, resist less, and your life moves to a rhythm you control, not one dictated by chaos or conflict. Take a moment now and continue with the next step to strengthen this practice.